Just when I thought this already awful week could not possibly get any worse, that this awful, terrible year, 2020 can go piss off. I mean, this year has been absolute shit. Just when I thought this year couldn't get any worse, we learned that the single greatest ring announcer of all time, easily the most imitated, and you know that you are the best when everybody imitates your work. One of the voices of the soundtrack of my childhood, Howard Finkel, passed away on Thursday at the age of 69. He was in poor health for a while. When I heard the news, I wasn't completely shocked. I knew he had been ill. 69, though, is still relatively young. And when you hear that it is someone that you grew up listening to and emulating, at home into my old WWF toy microphone. Some of you may have had the same one. It was the black one with the fuzzy windscreen on top. It had 6 buttons down the center of the microphone. I'm not thinking of the one with the little, the thin body that came out like in the mid-90s. This is the early 90s. And each button down the middle would be a different sound effect. So they had one for slams, and they had one for crowd noise, and I forgot what the other ones were for. I wish I still had mine to display. I'm actually really upset I don't have it anymore. It was one of my first microphones. Now I talk into one every week. But I can't tell you how many times I pretended that I was Howard Finkel. Announcing Hulk Hogan down to the ring, or the Macho Man, or any number of people winning the championship. If there's one thing our landlord knew on the other side of that wall, it was that the following contest is scheduled for one fall. Because they must have heard me shouting it 1,000 times, they were probably sick to death of hearing it. Jerry Lawler had speculated on his podcast a couple of years ago, while he was talking about the Fink being in really bad health, that he may have had a stroke. And I remember at the time thinking, well, that's kind of odd because it didn't sound like he was completely sure of himself. And that's it struck me as a very strange thing for somebody who would have been friendly with him or knew of him, somebody in the business, would kind of throw that out there if it may or may not have been true. According to Tommy Dreamer, who was one of the people who would visit Fink often, he did not have a stroke. He had a rare genetic brain disease. And the way he described it is that basically his brain was shrinking. And he was having some falls as a result of what was going on with his brain. Just a horrible thing. And you could tell from photos some of the wrestlers have been sharing who had visited with him that he had been living, in a nursing home, which is the worst place that you could be right now with this, virus spreading. So I hope we don't come to find out that that had anything to do with this, because that would be even more terrible. But I saw the picture that Dreamer posted of the time that he visited the Fink, and on the whiteboard in the background, you could see where one of the either nurses or aides wrote a message that said, please put channel number, whatever it was, on at 8 p.m. on Monday nights. Wrestling is on, with a big smiley face at the end of it. And man, that got me. Thank God I'm not on camera right now. This is a good thing. It's tough, that part got to me. He was a fan. After all these years, think of how long this guy was in that company and in the wrestling business. After all these years, he was still the biggest fan. His condition was serious enough that he stopped tweeting around the time that Bruno Sammartino passed away in 2018. In fact, his last tweet was about Bruno's death and how his legacy would live on forever. Of course, you can say the same thing now about the Fink. He was a New York Jets season ticket holder since day one. He was an avid New York Mets fan. He would tweet about them often. So when he stopped, I knew something must have happened. When Bobby Heenan died a few years ago, I felt the same way that I do now. Just this sense of sadness, that you can't shake. Sadness for somebody who I not only grew up listening to, but who, in Fink's case, by all accounts, to a T, Every story that you heard come out this week he was one of the nicest men that you could ever hope to meet. Vicky Guerrero posted something that I never knew, which blew me away, which is after Eddie Guerrero died. She said that the Fink was the one who escorted the body. He escorted Eddie's body from Minneapolis to Phoenix. And he called her later and told her, I didn't want him to be flown home by himself. Lanny Poffo said that there were only 2 people that he heard from after his brother died, after the Macho Man passed away, to offer condolences. And Howard Finkel was one of those people. He was the first person that Lanny Poffo heard from. Steve Lombardi, I think, was the other. Finkel was actually one of the people who got Randy Savage noticed by WWE management. We have Howard Finkel in part. I'm sure at some point somebody would have noticed this guy, but we have the Fink to thank in part for the Macho Man getting noticed when he did by WWE. But again, by all accounts, he was a class act all around. I don't think he could be mean to you even if he tried. When he was on that Legends House show on the network, one of the things they had to do on one of the episodes was they were going to do a roast. I guess they were going to roast each other. So they had to come up with jokes and they had to come up with material, and they had I think a comedian come in and try to help them. And they said Howard is the one that needed the most work, because here's this guy sitting across from Howard Finkel. And there's a scene, look, I'm sure the whole damn show is scripted as far as the plot lines for each episode. I mean, all reality television pretty much is, but especially that show. But there was Fink, and he's writing these corny jokes that, where he's supposed to be roasting people. And he said, I'm not mean-spirited. He said, I'm not mean-spirited, nor do I care to be mean-spirited. He could not bring himself to be mean-spirited. He said, if my material bombs, it bombs. I'm just here to have fun. That was the Fink. And I don't want to go negative because, Fink wasn't a negative person and it's not the place for it. But it is worth mentioning that sometimes it's the nice guys who get stepped on the most. And it always bothered me to hear stories about, because we hear about people like Jim Ross and all the ribs and the abuse and the bullying and all that stuff he had to endure. Even though he made a lot of money working for that company, he had a very successful, storied career in WWE, and Vince McMahon gave him so much. But, JR is one of those people you would always hear stories like that about. And it always bothered me when I would hear about some of the, the ribs they would play on the guy, or Paul Bear. Percy Pringle, he did a shoot interview many years ago. It was a sit-down shoot. It was him and Jim Cornette both. And Percy, there's another one, Gone Too Soon. But he talked about how certain people in the company, I don't think he ever said who, but certain people in the company treated Howard like shit. And more than once he would be in the back, and it would be so bad that he would see the Fink sitting down crying. Multiple times that happened. They made the man cry. That always angered me to hear that. But he loved his job. He was a loyal soldier for all those many years. He was the longest tenured employee in WWE history. I don't know if he was still on the payroll or not, in the last few years, but April 1st would have marked 40 years of employment for him with WWE. He started working for the McMahon family in 1975, but the 40 years goes back to April 1st, 1980. Vince Jr. founded Titan Sports in February of that year, and April 1st, Finkel was the first official hire for the company. Hence the 40 years. Now, how he got started is one of those cool stories of getting your foot in the door. And I haven't heard this in all the bios and everything mentioned this week, but it's a cool story. So what happened is, he talked to Slam Wrestling many years ago and told the story. And at the time, he was working as a part-time usher at the New Haven Coliseum. So this would have been in 1975. WWE, at that time, it was still the WWF, had run the Coliseum, and then all of a sudden they stopped. I assume because business just must not have been that good. So they stopped running the venue. And I think part of the problem is they weren't aware of the fact, or didn't think that their television was airing in the New Haven market. So they figure, well, why continue to run here if we're not doing well, we're not on TV here? We'll just go somewhere else. Fink was a big fan. He went to the building manager. He said, do you realize that WWE is on TV here every single week. And it turns out there was a UHF station that came out of Long Island. It came through crystal clear in New Haven, and it had WWE programming on it. Company didn't know. Even the building manager had no idea. So the building manager goes to Vince Jr. to tell him about this. And he said, look, I have this guy who works for me. He's a total nut for you guys, big fan. And he told me that your show comes through here clear as day. So they decided to take a chance. They ran the Coliseum again. And I think they may have taken advertising out this time on the station. And Vince later wanted to meet this usher. And so that was the first time that McMahon met Howard Finkel. He gave the Fink his phone number. Fink ended up telling him that he had some experience doing PA announcing, public address announcing back in high school. And Vince McMahon convinced his father, Vince Sr., to give Fink a shot at being a ring announcer. And that's how it all began, 1975. Then he went on to make his debut as a ring announcer at Madison Square Garden in 1977. There will never be another one like him. Not with that voice. He had that booming, iconic voice like he was born to be a ring announcer. There just was nobody better. The way he would put a special emphasis on those title change calls, and when he would say, and new, or two of the most iconic words in WWE history that would come out of this guy's mouth. He lent his voice to some of the most iconic moments in wrestling history. Think of all the moments, all the big matches, all the WrestleMania main events that his voice is attached to. For Hulk Hogan, for Randy Savage, Ricky Steamboat's win at WrestleMania 3. Fink is the one credited with giving Steamboat the Dragon nickname because he thought he looked a lot like Bruce Lee. That came from Finkel. Ultimate Warrior's first IC title win over the Honky Tonk Man, 28 seconds or whatever it was at Madison Square Garden. Warrior's WWF title win at WrestleMania 6. And when Warrior went into the Hall of Fame in 2014, Fink made one last Ultimate Warrior call in the ring when the Warrior walked out at the Superdome. Undertaker's first title win over Hogan at Survivor Series 91. I remember that call very well. Of course, the 92 Royal Rumble. How can I not mention that? Just too many to name. Too many to name. He did once say in an interview that Bret Hart was his favorite person to announce. I always loved the way that he would say Hitman. He would put the emphasis on Hitman, and then Hart, just the way he would say, he would hang on that Hitman. He can make reading the phone book an epic event. He's credited with coming up with the WrestleMania name itself. He was involved in the meetings ahead of that very first WrestleMania show. They started having meetings in '84. He remembered the Beatles and the impression that they made when they came over to the United States. It was Beatlemania. So he said, that was Beatlemania, why can't we have WrestleMania? And that was it. WrestleMania was born. But he did a lot more for that company than just ring announcing. He actually did some match announcing. He was quite good at that. That they didn't want him in that role, so that didn't last very long, but he could have had a future, as an announcer, like a Gorilla Monsoon or, a Jim Ross or somebody like that. He handled advertising for them. He worked for the magazine for a very long time. During the 90s, there were rumors that he would read through all of the newsletters, like The Observer, The Torch, every single week, and then report back to Vince McMahon and all of his cronies on what Meltzer is saying and what Keller is saying. Meltzer on Talk is Jericho one time said that Fink had his subscription under his wife's name, who was his girlfriend at the time, so that nobody would find out that he was a subscriber. But he was one of the longest subscribers of The Observer. A lot of wrestlers were and probably still are subscribers. They won't admit to it necessarily, but especially back then, you would always hear stories about all the people who would have to hide it in the back because it was very taboo. You didn't want to get caught with one of those rag sheets, brother. You didn't want to get caught with that. They'd go into the bathroom stalls and read it and stuff like that. Because back then, more so than now, now you can find everything on the internet. But back then, these guys wanted to know what was going on. Those newsletters were really one of the only Because you weren't going to find information like that in the magazines. A lot of them were kayfabed and everything, the after mags. But if you wanted real information on what other wrestlers were saying were going on in other promotions, or how much this guy was making, that's really what they were interested in. You would have to read the rag sheets. You'd have to read things like the Torch and the Observer to find out that information. So they knew everybody was reading it. But you didn't want to be caught in the locker room. You definitely did not want to be caught with it. I've even come across old RSPW threads for the RSPW Rewind segment. I'm talking threads going back to like 95, 96, 97. Talking about, rumors about the Fink. And people were convinced. They were convinced that he was browsing RSPW under an anonymous name and reporting certain things back to management, back to the company. The proof was in the WCW Nitro book that was released a couple of years ago, which is something like 600 pages long. By far the most detailed source of the Bischoff years, at least from the Nitro days onward to the very end. I have my hard copy, at the office. I never finished it. Now, of course, it's sitting in my desk at work, and I can't get into the office because everything is shut down. So a lot of good that does me. But in the book, they show a copy of an internal WWF report from June of 1996, I believe it was, labeled the Finkel Report. And in it has news from Dave Meltzer's hotline, represented, Keller's newsletter. So he would compile his own little Finkel Report and, distribute it to all the key people in WWE to keep them abreast of what was being talked about. What was fact, what was fiction, and everything that was going on. Go to WCWNitroBook.com if you're interested. There's a lot of good information. That's only one little sliver of what's in that book, but there's a lot of good stuff in that book. So Finkel was a man who played many roles in the company. He wore many hats, not only on camera, but behind the scenes as well. He was involved in certain angles on TV. He had his long-standing feud with Dr. Harvey Whippleman, and then Whippleman would snatch the microphone out of his hand. He would say it in the most disgusted way possible. They had, I think, a couple of tuxedo matches, one of which aired on Monday Night Raw in 1995, which is basically, you remember all those bra and panties matches we saw during the Attitude Era? Well, this was, it was kind of the same thing, but very much the opposite in many ways. Where they wore tuxedos, and the first person to rip the clothes off the other guy wins, and that was not a good sight to see. They tried to replicate the Jericho Ralphus stuff from WCW by doing something similar with Jericho and Howard Finkel the same month that Jericho came into the company. Only weeks later, he was doing this with Fink on screen. It didn't last very long, although I was amused when he would call him Harold or Edward, and he would be, it's Howard. And Jericho made a career out of that, right? He would call, like Tom Phillips, he would call him Todd and other things like that. So he did the same thing with Fink. And there was the time that Jericho was backstage and convinced Howard to go run out to the ring and take his job back at a SmackDown taping. Take your job back from Tony Chimel. This guy's taking your gig. And there's the Fink running down to the ring to the Ultimate Warrior's theme song. Shoved Chimel on his ass. Then Chimel attacked him. JR on commentary, he called him Warrior Fink. He had many more years left as a ring announcer, or he should have. He had a lot of gas left in the tank when they removed him from the role in the early to mid 2000s. By then he was doing some announcing. He was doing some pay-per-views and WrestleManias and stuff like that, but they slowly phased him out a lot sooner than they should have. And I understand you want to break in a new voice or two. I'm not saying don't hire any new ring announcers. Use this one older guy for, 50 years. Don't plan for the future. Justin Roberts has talked about Brandy Rose because she was doing ring announcing at one point. They've all had nothing but positive things to say about how helpful Fink was, even though these people were taking his job effectively. He was always very helpful, always a great, mentor to them. But he had many more good years left in him, and at that time they wanted Raw and SmackDown. They had different rosters. They wanted them to have different distinct voices. So you would have different ring announcers for each show. But they wanted to go for youth. It's always about youth. Why do you think they tried to knock JR out of the announce chair so many times, and they kept going back to him? They kept going back to Jim Ross. Same situation. I guess cosmetically, they figured they could upgrade from Howard Finkel. Not that Howard was, a supermodel, but nonetheless, when you think of a ring announcer lending his voice to these big moments, nobody did it better than the Fink. And I know that in later years, physically, he had some problems. He gained a lot of weight. But before that happened, he was still rocking and rolling. I'll never forget being at WrestleMania 28 in Miami and getting to meet him at Fan Access and overhearing him talking to some fans as they would come up to his table. He would sign whatever it was, whatever item they brought with them. And it was very clear, when he was asked and people would pay him a compliment, oh, I wish you were still doing ring announcing and that kind of stuff. It was very obvious, without him saying so specifically, that he was not thrilled about not being on TV anymore. He loved his job. He loved his gig. He was still good at it, and they took him off TV. But he also has the distinction of being the only person to appear at every WrestleMania from the very first one all the way through WrestleMania 32. In Dallas, when they had him doing the Hall of Fame segment, introducing all of the new Hall of Famers. If you remember, because I was at that WrestleMania in Dallas, if you remember my WrestleMania review after that show was over, one of the things that I commented on was Howard Finkel being in the ring, announcing all of the Hall of Famers. Then they kind of, the building goes dark, they throw it to the next video package, and everybody gets the hell out of the ring. And I distinctly remember looking at the ring and seeing Howard Finkel. He was down on the ground because I guess he was trying to maybe get out of the ring under the bottom row. I mean, he was very heavy at this point. Clearly, he was having problems. He was clearly having physical problems at this point. And there were just a whole group of like half a dozen guys, production crew, trying to get him out of the ring. They could not get him out of the ring. And it broke my heart to see that. And the following year in Orlando, WrestleMania 33, that was the very first one where he did not appear. And a lot of people were very upset about that. I was very upset about that. He had this great streak going, and now the streak is over. It's bad enough we lost one streak. Now we have to lose another. Mike Johnson was upset too. So imagine his surprise when, on his way back from Orlando to New York, they had to deplane because there was, some kind of mechanical issue. And when he got off the plane, he realized Howard Finkel was on the same flight as him. There's Howard. So he went over to talk to him, and he asked him, hey, why weren't you on the show? Why did the streak end? And Fink told him, don't blame WWE. It was not their fault. It was my choice, because he was having very bad back problems. And he did not want to take the chance of walking all the way down to the ring and embarrassing himself, which hit home with me when I read that because I remembered the year before and what I saw with my own eyes. And it was embarrassing. I'm sorry to say, it was very embarrassing. To see him need help like that to get out of the ring. And I'm sure he was thinking back about what happened the year before. I don't think it's any coincidence that it was after that incident that his WrestleMania streak, by his own choice, came to an end. Now, you also got to remember something else about that WrestleMania in Orlando. That aisle, from the stage to the ring, it was the longest ramp in WrestleMania history. It was comical. I mean, the stage was the greatest stage setup they've ever done. I thought it was beautiful. But the longest ramp they've ever had, I think the distance was 80 yards, almost the length of an entire football field. I remember everybody joking about how long The Undertaker's entrance was going to take. Even Undertaker, he wasn't walking the length of that ramp. He rose up from the ramp midway down. Remember they had that platform that rose up from the middle? He was no dummy. He left the same way. So that all makes sense. He was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2009 by his very dear, close personal friend, Mean Gene Okerlund. God, we lost Bobby Heenan in 2017, Mean Gene in 2019, and now Howard Finkel in 2020. That fucking sucks. That sucks. Survivor Series 2011. Sure, you all remember CM Punk's entrance. CM Punk wanted Howard Finkel to announce him down to the ring for his WWE title match with Alberto Del Rio. And I'm so happy I was in the building for that. A, because he got a huge pop, and that was cool to be a part of. And B, I didn't have to listen to Michael Cole and Jerry Lawler ruin the moment on commentary with their insufferable commentary as they were mocking him and making, I don't care who was in their ear and what was going on. You watch it back on TV, they practically ruined the moment. So I didn't have to listen to either one of them in the building. It was great. Fink had tears in his eyes with the pop that he got that night. The last time we heard his voice on TV was the Raw 25th anniversary show, which was not this year, last January. The part at the Manhattan Center when The Undertaker made his entrance. It was a recording of his voice. He wasn't there. But they played his voice announcing The Undertaker one final time down to the ring. Had the old red, white, and blue ropes. Old school Raw look. Undertaker was on that very first Monday Night Raw show in '93, so that was a really nice throwback moment. And I don't know if that was something Undertaker himself requested or whose idea that was, but that was very cool, for them to at least be able to lend his voice to that moment. So, another WWE original gone. There will always be one Howard Finkel. There's never been anyone better. There likely never will be. And his voice will always be associated with some of the greatest moments in wrestling history. He was a quality ring announcer, and more importantly, he was a quality human being. And he will be missed.